Hello everybody! Let's start with a clear statement. The Latvian Gambit is a controversial opening, and I would advise against using it in a regular non-blitz game, especially against a strong opponent, as the odds of losing are quite high. So, you might wonder why bother learning it? Well, the opening has a certain allure to those who enjoy taking risks and disrupting their opponents' plans. It's a bit of a wild card because exploiting its weaknesses isn't always straightforward, and even a cautious chess player can slip up when trying to punish our unconventional approach. In a sense, Black's goal with the Latvian Gambit is to create an imbalanced game with attacking opportunities, akin to a reversed King's Gambit. The central idea remains the same: open up the F file and intensify pressure on the white's king side. The success of this strategy depends on the initial move selection and the opponent's ability to navigate through the common traps set by Black. Let's make the first moves. E4, E5, knight to F3 and F5. The main line of the Latvian Gambit continues with knight takes the pawn and Black's move the queen to F6, with the idea of recapturing the pawn on F5 with the queen and gaining a tempo on the knight. White has several options to respond, including knight to C4, pawn to D4, knight back to F3, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. For this video, I've chosen 4 different scenarios that you might come across if you opt to play the Latvian Gambit. As usual, each variation is supported by an action online game, where I've highlighted key aspects and provided explanations for alternative moves. Let me start with the first game, which is in fact the less recommended line for Black. It is called a Fraser defense, and as the Fraser defense doesn't solve the weakened kingside problem, it usually leads to a loss. The game demonstrates the correct strategy for White. So let's make the moves: E4, E5, knight to F3, F5, knight takes the pawn and knight to C6. So as I said, this is called the Fraser defense, and Black should be ready for a complicated position which is difficult to play. The most common and the most straightforward response to the Fraser defense is just give it check, because Black is now in a very unpleasant situation. Maybe Black hoped for the alternative knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, to protect the pawn on the F5 by the bishop and reach a fairly solid position. Let's get back to the game, and the only viable response to this check is to block it by the pawn, because what happens if Black makes the second possible move? It's the king to E7, and it leads directly to the checkmate. Check by queen, the only retreat to D6, check by the knight. Again, the only possible move is to move the king to C5. Now another check, another forced move, and a nice mate by pawns. Here we go. Very impressive. Okay, so let's get back to the other move, G6. Now, of course, White takes the... Sorry, what did I do? Move to the to the end of the game. I apologize. Let's get back. I pressed the wrong key. Here, taking the pawn. Now, of course, Black cannot capture the knight by the pawn, because they would just reveal the unprotected rook on h8. So if they do that, white would continue with taking the rook, and white already has a significant material advantage, not to mention the totally devastated fortress of the black king. So let's get back to taking the pawn, and now the best response is in fact this, to attack the queen. So the queen retreats and black took the pawn. In fact, black can choose to save the rook, but the game would most likely end up with white's victory anyway. This would be a slightly better move. So now white would probably capture the bishop to do something with the stray knight, and after recapturing, a simple development move to open the diagonal for the bishop and protect the pawn would be simple enough and sufficient to keep the material and positional advantage. So let me just make a few more moves of the game, which is in fact already won for white, but let's just give it a look. Okay, so surely capturing the rook, opening the diagonal and attacking the queen by bishop. Okay, so the queen retreats, and black obviously wishes to capture the trapped knight, because it is now not possible to retreat, or both squares it can jump to are protected by black. So let's see how white continued, developing the bishop and pinning the knight. Good move, because we are ready to castle to the king side. And now attacking the knight. Of course, it's not possible to save the knight right now, so white simply continues with developing another knight, and black made this move. It seems that they don't rush to capture the knight, as it cannot escape anyway, and seems to be a move to develop the knight, prepare castling queenside and protect the pawn at d5. So what would happen if they captured the knight instantly? Yeah, white would simply capture this pawn, and after capturing by the knight they can give this check by queen, and black is forced to move the queen here to protect the bishop on h8, and now of course it's not sufficient because white can capture the knight and keep the material advantage. So the bishop went to e6, and white continues with some natural move. Yeah, it is aiming to reach this square, and because the knight is pinned, so it would increase the pressure against this point. Capturing the knight, yeah, doing exactly what I said before. Okay, it seems that black doesn't want to castle anymore, because it would lead to just revealing the king by capturing the knight and the pawn respectively. All-right. Now the knight is being attacked by 3 pieces and still pinned, so black is in a situation that simply cannot be improved too much. Let me just make a few more moves, and yes, okay, development move, maybe something like a waste of time, because it would be more straightforward just to make a direct attack by capturing the knight finally. So this, and of course capturing by the pawn would lead to an attack by the queen, so black would do better just to retreat, and white continues, revealing the king even more, checking with the queen anyway, and this is just one possible line that would lead to the ultimate victory. Let me just present it, and yeah, the rook is lost as well, and so is the bishop on the square h6, because the only move black can do now is to move the king here, and we capture this. Okay. Very well, I think we can stop right here because the rest of the game isn't interesting. Speaking of the Latvian Gambit, the opening theory, of course, white won the game. Black eventually resigned at the 22nd move. Let's switch to another line. If black has the courage to play this gambit, we will show the main line, which is the most robust strategy to follow. It's also the right way to apply the fundamental idea to enforce an attack through the f-file. Besides that, the game shows an interesting example of so-called Alechin's gun, and not only once. This time I decided to flip the board, because black played the gambit correctly and led the game to the victory. So again, let's make the initial moves: e4, e5, knight to f3, f5, and white captured the pawn. Black continues with queen to f6, and white played d4. This is definitely the recommended line for white. It's also possible to play knight to c4. Both moves keep the advantage of the white's position. So let's get back to d4, now d6, and yeah, the knight is under attack, so it finally retreats, and black recaptures the sacrificed pawn, developing the knight, and queen to g6, because black wants to protect the e-pawn by the queen, and vacate this field f6 for the knight. Also, it complicates white's castling a little, because if white decides to develop the bishop, the pawn at g6 would become, or g2 would become unprotected, and the queen would instantly capture that. So yeah, f3 to get rid of the pawn, developing the knight, taking the pawn, and black decided to block the file to the king first, because it could become a liability if they eventually capture this pawn and the file would open. Also, it's necessary to castle kingside and move the rook to the opened f-file to support the attack. g3. Yeah, it seems that it prevents the bishop's check on the h4 too. Before, it was possible to move here, check, and do some other stuff like taking the pawn by the bishop, because retaking by the queen would just make the white's king position too vulnerable. Okay, let's get back here. g3, bishop to g4 develops and attacks the queen at the same time, and white played bishop to e2. Yeah, I would say that's a mistake, because black will win one central pawn. Let me show you. Capturing the bishop, capturing by knight, and now the pawn on e4 is no longer protected. We capture that, so the material is even, and the queen is in a very dominant position in the board center, and also the rook at h1 is under attack. White decided to castle. Yeah, despite the weakened king side, it's surely better than just move the rook to f1 and leaving the king in the center where the knight is already pinned. Okay, castling, and black castles to the queen side. Now attacking the queen, retreating to d5. So As black no longer owns the white side bishop, it was exchanged for another bishop. The only upside of moving the queen to d5 is to drive off the white knight, but the knight would eventually change its position anyway, so perhaps black could make some better move. Okay, retreating and attacking the queen, h5. Let me just make these moves a little faster before we get to the Alechin's gun, which I just want to show you. Capture, develop, check, king moves. Okay, here it is. This is it. Rook, knight, queen, rook. All of them on the same opened file. This is called Alechin's gun. I think that the former world champion Alexander Alechin was the first one who used that against equally strong opponent, and from since then it is called like that. This formation is called RQR by the symbols of these pieces: rook, queen, rook, and the pressure on this H file will slowly turn the scale. So let's see what other moves had been performed. As you can see, black constantly presses against h2 and the king side at all, which will eventually be the ultimate advantage and leads to the victory. Okay, capturing. Now the gun is temporarily cancelled and we have it back, and this is very interesting position. Let's call it the double Alechin's gun, because the white one is in fact on rank, not file, but still 3 major pieces on the same line, and 3 pieces attack the pawn, 3 pieces protected, plus the king, of course. Let's just make some other moves to see how the game continued, and yeah, it seems that black managed to exchange the pawn. No, number of pawns it's equal, so black just recapturing. So black has a knight against a pawn and the game is practically won for them. The rest is just a matter of technique. I think we can skip it and switch to the third game. This variant resembles the King's Gambit reversed the most, and black gets the good opportunity to control the center. Again, we will observe the game from the black's perspective. e4, e5, knight to f3, f5, and instead of capturing the pawn with the knight, white decided to capture the f-pawn. So, as I said, the resemblance of the King's Gambit accepted is apparent, and thanks to the white knight on f3, black can follow up with the pawn advance, moving the pawn to e4. Okay, this is not the recommended answer, because black will have a more robust position after both queens are placed on the e-file, protecting the pawn. d3, and bishop retakes the pawn. So black won the pawn back, but risks creating a weak isolated pawn on the e-file, because after more capturing there would be just this pawn and it wouldn't be protected by any other pawns on the adjacent files. Bishop attacks the queen, protects the king, and now the position is almost balanced. So it seems that white already lost their advantage. Capturing. This is a mistake. It was necessary to insert the capture of the pawn first, so the queen would be freed. The diagonal would allow her to have more moving possibilities. So what happens now? Okay, So yes, now the queen is under attack, and white decided to capture the queen. Black recaptures the queen, of course, and white continues with capturing the unprotected pawn, and black makes this move, creating a new queen with a check, so white is forced to capture the queen and now develops the knight. Okay, so black has a knight for 2 pawns and is in a very stable position. Strategically, the game is won for them, so I will only make a few more moves to demonstrate how the game continued. By the way, if you want to observe the game just in a slower pace, I'm pretty sure that all these games have been added to this channel as standard non-commented videos, so it shouldn't be too difficult to find them. Yes, and I think that white resigned at this position. Okay, and the last game I prepared for this video, it describes a line which is basically what attracts many players to the Latvian Gambit, as white spots the opportunity to attack the weak point f7. Let me show you. It is called Mayat attack, I think. So as I said, black attacks the weak point f7. However, black is ready to launch a counterattack with their own queen and unleash destruction on the white king's base. Let's see. So capturing the pawn. Now white captures this pawn and 2 pieces attack this weak point, which looks horrible, but black has a secret weapon and developing the queen to g5. This is a typical queen charge against the original aggressor. Another option would be to sacrifice some material to keep the stray white queen isolated from the rest of the board. For example, this move, d5. Now white would probably do this check like in the first game we analyzed. This is, blocking the diagonal, capturing. So black sacrificed the rook, and now the king's move blocks the queen from retreating, mostly on any squares that would support the attack. It can retreat back to the white's camp, but it would simply mean that the attack is over. Moving here. Now the queen is under attack, moving here, bishop here, and despite the material advantage, white isn't in a very good position because, as I said, the queen is isolated, the bishop does nothing here and nothing else is developed. So it would be very interesting to continue. Let's get back to this queen charge. And of course, queen attacks both the knight and the pawn on g2, so white must do something about that. They decided to protect the knight. This is a safer line for white. An immediate attack with the knight may backfire. Let me show you. It would be like moving the king here, but of course now black would capture the pawn, and white is forced to protect the rook. This is the only way, and now we simply develop the knight, and if white continues capturing the rook, we will open the diagonal for the bishop while attacking the white bishop. So we do it with a tempo, and if white decides to come back to protect the king, we would simply move the bishop here, and the position is very sharp. And again, despite the sacrificed material, black is definitely not in a bad position. There are many ways how to support the attack with the knight, developing the other knight, moving the bishop, the second bishop to the attack position, castling queenside, and eventually add the rook to the attack formation, while the knight would be probably lost for white. Let's come back. So this move was played, and black of course captured the knight, and white decided to do this check. This is definitely not for the faint of heart, because both queens assaulted the opponent's fortress, and it's mostly it's a race to victory or defeat. So yeah, blocking the diagonal. Now white can move this check. It wasn't possible in the first game, so the king is forced to retreat, checking here by the queen and attacking the queen at the same time. So black is forced to exchange the queens. This. We are still in check, so we must put the bishop here. And now white decided to retreat because the bishop cannot do anything else here, and vacate the square for the knight, because now there is a risk, there is a threat of forking the king and the rook on f7. So we captured, what did we capture? Yeah, the bishop, and of course white performs this fork, moving the king. And now, interesting position, white got greedy and captured the wrong piece, because the rook was basically harmless here. It didn't support the attack in any way, but the bishop is strong in this position and will be soon accompanied by the second bishop, and we know that the bishop pair is sometimes stronger than a rook, or almost always, I would say. But black didn't catch the opportunity, because it would be a lot stronger to do this, open the diagonal for the bishop and block the diagonal for the white bishop. So now when white captures the pawn, we would attack it with the knight, and if white protects the bishop with their own knight, we would move the bishop here, and now the knight wouldn't escape. Okay, so rest of the game is not too interesting, because both players made blunders and white eventually won. The analysis was mostly focused on the opening anyway. Very well. So, what's the final verdict? While the Latvian Gambit is not considered to be a sound opening at the highest levels of play, it can be a powerful weapon in the hands of a skilled and aggressive player. The opening has been used successfully by several grandmasters throughout history, including the famous Mikhail Tal. Overall, Latvian Gambit is an exciting and challenging opening that can lead to dynamic and unpredictable games. However, it requires careful study and preparation to use effectively, and may not be suitable for players who prefer more solid and conservative opening. Okay, thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.